I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me today to talk about my work on Club Penguin. Okay, so I will begin now, and as I say, do apologise for all that messing about. Okay, so I hope you can see the slideshow, and if not, do link to the one that I have on the web. My avatar normally looks a lot plainer than this. But I thought that this wonderful venue deserved a little dressing up. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions along the way, and I'll stop now and again to ask questions, to sort of you know, catch up with the discussion. Okay, because I know that all of you have got a lot of experience in virtual worlds, and we can draw on that in reflecting on the implications for young children. Okay, so in today's talk I'm going to share with you on my research on children's use of virtual worlds. I'm going to focus on Club Penguin, which is Disney owned, and the talk focuses on children aged 5 to 11 who attend a primary school in the north of England. Okay, so I'd like to start by showing you this slide. This is from a UK company, K0. They are an organisation that has been tracking user accounts of children's virtual worlds for some years. And this is the first quadrant in their 2009 chart of virtual worlds registered account. And this one charts virtual worlds that are targeted at children aged from 5 to 10. So it's a couple of years out of date now. It's 2009, but I can't find an updated one. But it gives you an idea of the popularity of some of these. So the largest circle here belongs to Pop Tropica, and that's got 83 million accounts. And then Webkins has 10 million accounts, and Pixie Hollow 2 million. So you can see the popularity of these sites internationally. These are not just US and UK figures. These are international figures. And then this second quadrant, this outlines virtual worlds for children aged 10 to 15. And the largest world here is Habbo Hotel, which some of you may be familiar with, you know, for teenagers. That's got 158 million accounts. And Neopets has 58 million. So there are over 200 worlds in operation or development for children and young people over 18. So it's a growing commercial market. You can see here that Club Penguin's in the 10 to 15 section, but actually children from around 3 start to use it regularly. And Club Penguin's the world that I'm going to talk about today. I don't know if any of you are familiar, maybe you've visited it with Kai earlier on, or maybe you've got children yourselves who use it. It's one of, as we've seen, many virtual worlds, and they all have, you know, a number of features. So if I just talk about some of the features that these worlds have, they generally enable children to customize avatars. And some, you know, more than others. So Club Penguin, for example, that enables children to change the colours of their penguins, and if they buy a membership, then they can change its clothes and so on. Some of the sites enable much more creativity in relation to avatar generation and identity changing. There's inevitably moderators on many of the sites, because in order to make sure that parents feel okay about their children using them, they'll often have software that tracks undesirable texts according to the adults governing the sites. And inevitably children have ways of getting around these. So I've seen them where they ask each other, you know, how old they are, and they put in the number of stars for, you know, for the age. So I'll just catch up with a couple of the questions here. So someone asked about the group. One of the questions the group will have is about the diagnostics of various real sorry, I've lost that question. But in terms of definitions, they are sort of very fluid definitions. Some of these sites may not be virtual worlds as you all recognise them. They often, just let children play individually and not with groups and so on. So it is a very fluid definition of virtual worlds that K0 uses. Games that they often have games that earn children in world currency, and the children can buy various goods with that. Okay, moving on then to think about this particular virtual world, Club Penguin. I think one of the things that we're seeing now is a very fluid dimension, sort of basically the way in which online and offline worlds for children meet are becoming much more fluid and diverse. And Luart suggests that the geography of play is the sum of core and peripheral play practices, consists of both physical and digital elements, of tactile and non-tactile components, objects and connections. And we see this geography of play now in young children's worlds because of this diffuse nature between the online and offline. So let me give you an example of this. In relation to Club Penguin, we can see a range of goods that are sold that relate to the virtual world. So, for example, you can buy T-shirts with Club Penguin on, puffles, which are the in-world pets. You can buy key rings and cushions and so on. There's a Nintendo DS version of Club Penguin, so that you can play on your Wii or PlayStation and accrue in-world currency that you can spend elsewhere. Okay, so what we're seeing now is children moving across these worlds, so playing on the Wii and then taking that currency into the virtual world itself. We're also seeing that in terms of clickables, so technologies that you can wear. And again, Disney are a bit ahead of the market here in relation to those. So the virtual world Pixie Hollow, the children can get bracelets with charms. Each of these charms unlocks online goodies, and friends can click bracelets together in the offline world to become, with their friends, and so that when they're moving between online and offline worlds, they can be sharing goods and currency. So commercialism very much at the heart of some of these worlds, particularly the Disney world. Okay. I'll move up now to think about this, the commercial and playful dynamic between online and offline in relation to Club Penguin. But before that, I'll just provide a very brief overview of Club Penguin for those of you who may not be familiar with that particular world. It was bought by Disney. It was developed by an independent company and bought by Disney for something like $350 million in 2007. So you can see the sort of commercial property that Club Penguin and these worlds are. When users log on to Club Penguin, for those when they log on, each user has a penguin avatar in an igloo home, and that navigation bar at the bottom enables children to engage in chat. Use emoticons, animate their avatar, and so on. Okay, so I'll open up for questions now. Could you summarise for me, Rurik, some of the questions that have been raised so far? Because I've sort of rushed through quite a lot. I'll go back and see what I can catch up with.
No problem. Chavi was asking about working with students with autism spectrum disorder.
Yes. I haven't worked with children on the autistic spectrum disorder. I've worked with children who have special educational needs. They have challenges in reading and writing, and they certainly respond really well to some of these virtual worlds, not all of them. But I do think it's got potential for children because they can move at their own pace, especially in the safe chat servers. There are servers where children have open chat, and then safe chat servers where they can only choose from a particular set of phrases and words, and those particular spaces have proved beneficial for children who would feel intimidated in open chat. Okay, so moving on then, I'll just show you sort of what the avatars look like if you're not sort of familiar with these little penguins. There's 2 levels of membership, free and paid, and because children who have paid membership, they can buy clothes for their avatars. Already it sets up, different forms of capital, as Bourdieu outlines. So economic capital, which then translate to social and cultural capital. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Children being very aware of who are members and who are not, and who can be invited to their parties and so on. So capital very much shapes children's in-world practices. Okay. So, any more questions on Club Penguin before I move on? I'll just skip back a sec. Okay, no, I think I'm up to date there. So, moving on then to look at the sort of igloos. These are the home spaces. Now, this child has got membership, and so she's bought herself a split-level igloo. You can see here she's decked it out in party gear. And that is in real contrast to the members who are not able to do that. This, for example, is an example of a child who does not have membership and isn't able to deck her igloo out in the same way. So you can see here's the open chat. And interestingly, although I said these were, someone asked, can you earn money? Yes, you can earn money through games. And these games are played individually. Also, there are various cheat sites around the web, and a lot of children are able to, get their money through cheats. And to some extent, I think that Disney sort of allowed this to happen. They don't close down sites, don't close down accounts where they know there's some use of these sort of penguin cheat sites, and perhaps it's a way of generating interest. But also, the children do spend a lot of time in world on these games, and they accrue money. Okay, so moving on then, that's just a brief overview of what Club Penguin is like. I want to move on now to sort of talking about how I conducted these studies. So basically, what I did was, over 3 years, I've worked in one school. It's a primary school in the north of England. Now, it's primarily white working class, so it's limited study in that it's looking at one community. But what I've done is look at these children over 3 years and trace their movement in and out of Club Penguin and into other varied sites. But I think these kinds of studies need undertaking with a whole range of children from across ethnic and linguistic groups. So the first study in 2008, 175 children aged 5 to 11 completed an online survey using Google Docs. I interviewed 26 children aged between 5 and 11, where I asked them about their virtual world use in greater depth. And then 3 11-year-old children were filmed at home using Club Penguin over the period of 1 month. And altogether, I videoed 8 hours, 48 minutes of children using Club Penguin. It was sort of over-the-shoulder video of children, and as they used it, I asked them what they were doing and asked them to reflect on their practices. The data from the second study was collected most recently, and this was collected in relation to a study that I'm engaged with the Universities of London and East London, and it was a study funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And it was focused on looking at playground games and rhymes in a new media age, and looking at how playground games have changed, due to new technologies, how they're impacted on by media culture and so on. And it included a 2-year ethnography of playgrounds in Sheffield and London. and 181 children at the Sheffield school, this same school that had conducted the 2008 study, they completed an online survey of media use. And the children then drew maps of their online and offline friendships, and then I interviewed 11 children, 5 boys and 5 girls, about these maps. So that's the data that I'm drawing from in discussing this. Someone's asking about how did we have 5-year-olds completing online Google Docs survey. Those children were helped on a one-to-one basis by myself and the teacher involved in the study. A couple of the children were able to complete questions independently, but generally those in the 5 and 6-year-old age ranges were helped by myself. These children were used to using Google Docs. The IT teacher invited me into the school to do this work, and he'd used Google Docs quite a lot in his classroom curriculum. And in fact, I was invited in to do this work with the teacher because he wanted to do some work on Club Penguin in the classroom. But ironically, the school had a firewall that wouldn't let us get into the Club Penguin to be able to use it. So, okay, I realise that I'm turning terribly rude with my back to the auditorium. I'm sort of finding it a bit hard to navigate, so do excuse me. I will try and turn round when I can as I'm speaking. Okay, second language users. Yes, this study was with a white working class school where they were primarily all monolingual. So I'm not able to talk about children who are bilingual using these worlds, and I would be really interested if anybody had done some work in that area. Again, I think it could facilitate a lot of really rich language use, and children would be able to type in the Open Chat service in their first language, so it would have a lot of potential. But I'm not able to talk about bilingual children from the data that I've got. Okay, so these were the 2 studies, and there were some differences in relation to, over that 3 years in relation to what children were doing in virtual worlds. Yeah, I agree that someone, To Be Destiny, talks about second language acquisition research being key to think about neural diversity, and obviously there's a lot of research in this area on the cognitive positive benefits of bilingualism, and I'm sure that would be also the case in relation to their use of virtual worlds, but as I say, I'm afraid I'm not able to address that in this particular data. Okay, so in terms of the key findings and the differences between them, you can see from this slide that just over half of the children in the school in 2008 used virtual worlds on a regular basis, and the most popular was Club Penguin and then Barbie Girls. But the data from the second project, collected in 2010, by then 96% of the children stated that they use virtual worlds. And whilst the early users were using Club Penguin and Barbie Girls, that had moved on. And a world, I don't know if you have this in the States or other countries, Moshi Monsters have become very, very popular. So yes, Sabine says it's a jump, and it certainly is a jump. And partly, I think, these things are viral, aren't they? So I think in this particular playground, children were from 2008 talking about their virtual world use, and then other children obviously wanting to be engaged in this with their peers. Whether this is the same in other schools, I'm just not sure. Someone's talking about what is the nature of monitored and mediated immersive virtual worlds, and while the child is also being measured of neural and body processes. Yeah, again, I don't know of research in that area, and I think that would be really interesting in all kinds of ways. This study was based on interviews and observations of children, and some survey data to give me a broad overview. And there are limitations in that, although I do think that because of that case study material, I've got a good sense of what the children in this school have been doing over the last 3 years on these kinds of sites. Okay, so moving on then. These are some of the reasons the children gave for enjoying the sites, which included, playing games, talking to friends, reading books and so on. Within Club Penguin, there were a range of literacy practices offered, such as a virtual library, and the children were saying that they were really enjoying these, but the key drivers were playing games and chatting with their offline friends. They were the main reasons. Similarly, these were from comments from girls, very similar reasons given by boys. That basically it was interaction with their friends and play, being able to dress their avatar, play about in their rooms and so on, were very much the key drivers for these virtual worlds for both genders. One difference between boys and girls was that the boys mentioned more often the attractions of virtual violence. And again, this is very similar to offline play in our Playgrounds project that we've been conducting over the last 2 years. Whilst girls do engage in play fighting now and again, it's primarily boys in the playgrounds that are doing this. And similarly in virtual worlds, you can see here boys talking about the ways in which they enjoyed the virtual play fighting. In relation to who children were playing with online, yes, To Me Destiny says this might be because of current over-socialisation of violence, but I would say that violence has always been a key theme in children's play throughout centuries, and in relation to all of the research on violence and play, I would say the jury's still out really in relation to how much it has an impact on children's play in the offline world. And certainly what we found in the Playgrounds project was that children were able to were quite nuanced around the modalities of play fighting, and were able to tell when fighting was about to slip into real fighting, whereas the adults in the playground were more likely to identify fighting as real when it was play. Okay. But yeah, no, To Me Destiny, yeah, this is not simply celebratory. It doesn't mean that the media isn't causing damage. I mean, there's some interesting research that shows that children who are living in homes with domestic violence are more likely to be affected by the violence that they see on the media. So absolutely, I think we can't make any clear judgments around this, but there are a range of issues that as adults we need to be aware of as children use these virtual worlds. But certainly, the evidence that we have from the Playground project is that there are, very few children who, as we found, weren't able to distinguish between real and play fighting, or became disturbed between, the differences between play and real fighting. Again, that doesn't dismiss, in terms of virtual worlds, how much online bullying and so on that we see. But interestingly enough, I've come across very little of that in 3 years of watching these children on Club Penguin and Marsh Monsters and so on. This school does do a lot of work on bullying, so whether that it has any relationship to outcomes in relation to online bullying, I'm not sure. So in terms of who children played with in the study, we can see here that children most often played with children that they already knew, such as siblings and their peers in their classrooms. And I often would observe children, film them in the homes, and they'd be sitting with their sisters next to them, and they'd both be playing in Club Penguin, but they'd actually be sat next to each other. Okay, so I'll catch up with some questions now. Okay.
The bear asks, is there really much difference? The effects of cartoon violence, video game violence, and television violence.
Yes, well, research on this shows that children are more able to distinguish the modalities of cartoon violence than television violence, for example, on the news and so on. But that they actually find the violence within news programmes more upsetting than violence within the television programmes. So I think the modalities between cartoon and video game and virtual worlds are really interesting, but that's not something that I studied, within this project. All I would say is that, within the Playgrounds project, modality was, an absolutely key issue for us in terms of looking at, you know, what children were understanding about how real the violence was between them in that playground. Okay, so in terms of who they played with, you can see here I asked Sally, Sally was one of the children that I observed, you know, when they were saying that they liked the look of somebody and they were going to make friends with them, what were they looking for exactly? And you can see here that Sally said, well, you know, she's looking at the clothes, the hair and the posh houses. But she said it didn't matter her, she had a lot of playing friends, so she was distinguishing between the members and the non-members in developing her friendships. And she made it clear that she knew that other members of Club Penguin didn't do this. You know, they actually, she noted that other users did ignore people who were non-members, and certainly there were parties which non-members were not invited to. So for Sally, it was very much about their initial visual appearance. For John, another child, he decided very clearly in relation to the names of children, so the names of avatars, so he wouldn't choose avatars that he felt, you know, sounded odd. Emily made her decision around things like whether children showed off a little or told lies or exaggerated, as she felt, within World. So, for example, she says here that she says that she would try to avoid children who showed off about crimes. And I said, and say what? And she said, oh, you know, like I've nicked a car today or something. And I said, well, what do you say to them? And she said, well, you can add them as your friend, but I don't. I just have friends I already know as friends. So for some of the children, they won't make friends with unknown others in World. They'll only play with their peers that they pre-arranged to meet. Other children, a little bit more open than Emily, but still I found that the children were more often playing with peers and classmates and siblings than they were unknown others. At least that's what they were reporting to me, and that was certainly the case in, you know, in the observations that that I made. Okay, I'll just catch up any questions. No, if I move on then to, you know, thinking a little bit more about children navigating social friendships online, and what markers that they use to identify and describe identities. Okay. So trust was a key theme for children. Again, this is probably, you know, I'm sure that many of you will have experienced this in relation to your own use of virtual worlds and second lives. You know, we make decisions about who we're going to trust in World, and sometimes it was hard for the children to articulate exactly what it was that made them trust others or not. But John talked about the way in which representations of avatars related to trust for him. And I talked to the children about, you know, what they felt the avatars were for them. You know, were they a doll, or how do they think about it? Was it a friend? Was it themselves? And again, like adults, they move from first to third person to talk about their avatars, relating to, you know, how immersed they felt within the environment at that particular time. So John here talks about, there's a penguin on his website. I think it's like representing you, he said, because if you dress up as someone completely different or something completely different, you can't really trust anyone really. So for him, his penguin, he didn't really change his avatar that much at all. He was a non-member, so he's limited. You know, he was limited. But you know, for other avatars, Emily, for example, she changed her penguin quite a lot, and in fact she switched the gender of her avatar quite frequently, whereas the other children tended to stick with the same gender as them. Again, that's different. You know, Cafe and others have looked at older children in Wyville, and they were much more fluid in their identity play, but I found these children really were quite conservative in relation to playing around with identities, particularly the younger children in relation to gender. Emily decided that she wanted to have a male penguin avatar as well as female, so that she could dress up in, she could buy clothes right across both genders. So children really differently orientated in relation to how they felt towards this, playful and imaginative world in relation to identities. The cultural scripts that guide in-world play are really quite clearly defined by the producers in Club Penguin. But the children did, demonstrate agency about the way they circumvented producers' intentions and developed transgressive modes of play. So it wasn't as if they were totally controlled by Disney in relation to, how they represented themselves within world. And as I spoke earlier, there were lots of cheat sites and so on that children were able to get around the producers' intentions. So moving on to play, in the note card I've given a link to a paper that I wrote on play in virtual worlds, and I examined a number of types of play that occurred in Club Penguin. I'll talk briefly about this. And if you're interested in this area, I'd say follow up on the paper. But basically, as one might expect, because of your experiences in Second Life, the kinds of play categories of play that children will engage with offline were found within Club Penguin. So fantasy play involves children creating, imaginative narratives involving characters that are not real life. In inverted commas, and Club Penguin promoted fantasy play through giving children costumes and so on. But children were also playing fantasy play themselves, without the Disney-inspired costumes. Rule-bound play were obviously an integral part of the world because they had to accrue in world currency through these rule-bound games. However, in addition to the games offered by the producers of virtual worlds, children reported in the interviews playing rule-based games that they'd played first in the offline world, such as hide and seek. And whilst rough and tumble play is normally used to describe physical play, such as play fighting, wrestling and chasing, I adopted the term in this instance to describe that online play that involved deliberate attempts by children to engage in avatar-to-avatar contact, including chasing and snowball fights. And again, in Caffey and Field's work, I noticed that the tweens there were projectile throwing in Wyville. So similar kinds of behaviour in Club Penguin. And then finally, socio-dramatic play. These were sort of play based on domestic everyday practices. And just as children's socio-dramatic play in the offline world, children reported adopting a range of adult roles and drawing on adult scripts, such as having parties and getting drunk. And again, this is no different to offline research, because we see in socio-dramatic areas within classrooms children engaging in those kinds of adult cultural scripts in their play. So very rich range of play in Club Penguin. In the Playground project, interestingly, we found children reporting instances of play based on virtual worlds, including Club Penguin. So, for example, a game of tag in the playground became a game of tag in which once you were tagged, you became a penguin. So again, another example of these online and offline worlds merging. Okay, I'll just check if there's any questions that I've missed there, because I am racing on. Okay, I can't see any. So I'll move on. Okay, thank you to be Destiny. Okay, so moving on then to thinking about literacy, and then I'll move on finally to talk about online and offline friendships. So I analysed the literacy in world, and I'll not talk about this today much because I've talked about this before, but I looked at the kinds of literacy practices children were engaged in, and used a number of categories that were developed by Kearney and Rouge in there. They looked at young children's literacy activities in families in the offline world, and a range of literacy functions were identified there. So literacy for establishing and maintaining relationships, literacy for accessing or displaying information, literacy for pleasure and self-expression, and literacy for skills development. And then I added another category to that from a previous study, literacy for identity construction and performance. And one that emerged after the study was literacy for establishing and maintaining social networks, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can see here that children used emoticons, messages, across all of these different functions of literacy. So, to set up friendships, to maintain friendships, to navigate the world, to reading clues on the games, reading books in the library, language play between each other, using chat in group play, and so on. So lots of ways in which literacy was embedded within the children's use of Club Penguin. And Constance Steinkilder has talked about the way in which in massive multiplayer online games such as World of Warcraft, adults use ritualised play to develop a community of practice. And this was very much the case within Club Penguin, in which the children joined together, with various phrases being repeated over and over, and in ways to sort of to develop communities and networks with a shared purpose. So I've looked at this in relation to Goffman's works. It seems to me that Goffman's notion of the interaction order is very interesting to think about in relation to Club Penguin. Goffman looks at the way in which, in terms of microsociology, both verbal communication and non-verbal communication work together to construct a social order, so that when that order breaks down, we know ways in which to repair it, by apologising and so on. And what it seemed to me is, in watching Club Penguin over those, over 8 hours of video that I had, is that the children very much use literacy to construct and maintain a social order. So, on the surface, Club Penguin can appear to be rather chaotic, penguins rushing about willy-nilly, but the children constructed a sense of order for themselves through the sending and receiving of messages, emoticons and postcards. So they told me things like, well, you have to send a postcard to a friend to make a friend, and then you have to send a postcard to do this, that and the other. So they'd invented these rules for themselves, these social rules, which told them, what it was to make friendships and maintain friendships within world. And as Mitzel says, literacy there was used to render transactions as predictable, reliable and legible. That's not to say that Club Penguin was totally a predictable world. It was, pretty chaotic, but nevertheless literacy, formed a thread and enabled children to navigate that. And that was really important, I think, for the children who were a little bit nervous about going online, not as confident in the virtual environment as others. Through these ritualised practices, that that enabled them to feel a sense of home in Club Penguin. Okay, so I want to now move on to thinking about the relationship between their offline and online friends in Club Penguin. So in the second study that was conducted, we've just finished it actually, but in 2010 I collected this data. What I asked children to do was to draw a map of their online and offline friendships. So on this slide you can see a sociograph, and it gives you an example of one class, a year 3 class, children 8 and 9 in here. Now 145 children completed these maps of their online and offline friendships. So in this map, for example, red lines denote their online relationships, and the black lines, the relationships in the playground. And of these 145 children, 68% of the children had online friends in their class. So this concerned me, I have to say, when I first started this study, because I thought that the children who were not online were going to become more socially isolated offline. Because, if we see online play as thickening offline social friendships, well, what would it do in relation to those children who had no access? And so one of the things that I was concerned about in the interviews was to try and pursue, how far children did feel excluded. In terms of a quantitative analysis, it wasn't the case. I looked at children who had online and offline friends and their average number of friends. And children who had both online and offline friends had an average of 6.97 friends, whereas children who didn't have online friends had an average of 6.47 friends. So, a minimal difference, which was quite reassuring. And it was only really when I began to interview the children that I found that it was even more reassuring than that. Not only did it not make a difference in relation to numbers of friends, but certainly in terms of quality of friendships. Those children who didn't have an online presence didn't report feeling excluded. So this is James, who's 7, and he talked about his dad not letting him go online. And I said, well, did you ever ask him? And he said, yeah, but he still said no. And when I asked him over and over, he said, no, no, no. And I said, did you feel upset or sad about that? And James said, no, I didn't thought I was missing out. Now, for those of you who might need some translation from the Yorkshire dialect there, out means anything. So James didn't feel he was missing anything by being excluded from this online play. And this was corroborated by his classmate, Carl. What I did in the interviews, I interviewed children who were at opposite ends of the graph, in a sense. So I interviewed children who had no online friends, or very few, and then the children who were at the centre of an online nexus, just in order to see, what the two extremes were like. And Carl was at the opposite end in this class. He was the most popular person in relation to his online friends. And he talked about playing with James. And you can see here that Carl felt that he didn't play with online with James because he didn't have an account. Actually, that was one of those times when you're questioning children where you just you realise what silly questions you sometimes ask. Because I said to him, why didn't you play with him online, James? And he said, well, because he didn't have an account, of course. Okay, and I said, and did it make any difference to how you felt about him playing in the playground? And Carl said no, because they played a lot. And that was replicated across the year groups. Children reporting that it just didn't actually make much difference in relation to both the people that they didn't play with very much in the playground, but also the ones that they did. And again, Mary here, you can see she had online and offline friends, but it made no difference to her in terms of when she went into the playground and who she chose to play with. I said, does it make any difference, do you think, in the playground, or when you're playing with Moshi Monsters, do you think I'm going to play with her or not think about it? And she said, no, don't think about it. I just go to school and see who's there and play with them. So again, I think that in relation to online and offline, what we can see here is almost a sort of convenience. Children often talked about they'd play with online those children that they could find online at that particular time, or they'd rearrange to meet their classmates at particular times of day. Another theme that arose in the interviews was that children decided not to play with children online based on children's behaviour in the offline playground. So in this interview, Carl talked about how he didn't want to play with Kyle on Moshi Monsters. He said, he might get banned, and I said, why? And he said, Kyle swears when he goes around to play football at his grandma's. Kyle swears, and he was worried that if he play with Kyle online, then he might lose his account in Moshi Monsters. And Kyle had asked, to be Carl's friend online, and Carl had said no because he didn't want to get banned from it. So interesting patterns here in relation to the way in which their online and offline friendships interrelate. And again, Ali, slightly older, she's aged 8, and she, again talking about the way in which who she decides to play with on the internet. I asked her, how do you decide who you're going to play with on the internet and who you're not? And she said, I go up to them and talk and see if they're nice or not, and then if I go on the internet and play with them, I know they're not going to mess around with my stuff on it. So that trust that they built up in the online worlds, really enabling them to take those over to the offline worlds. So just to sort of summarise really in relation to the relationship between their online and offline play. I think we can see here that children also owned a lot of artifacts, as I said earlier, in games in relation to Club Penguin, the Nintendo games, the cards, the key rings, and so on. They played games in the playground based on that. So to them, the online-offline distinction, just wasn't there, wasn't real, wasn't meaningful to them. This will be no surprise to those of you who do research in virtual worlds. But I think it's important to have data that demonstrates that, for young children, this is very much the case. So just to sort of move to a conclusion here, I think that, you could argue that movement across narratives and different media and different modes is no different to previous eras. Children might have encountered a story in a printed book and then visualise that story in their minds and then incorporate elements of that story in the play. They move from the virtual realm of the imagination in that sense to the physical world of imaginative play. And again, I think the virtual online world constitutes this kind of different order of modality. Tom Belstorff talks about, you can distinguish between the offline and online world, and that's certainly the case. Ontologically, they're very different. But I think, that sort of distinction between them is quite diffuse in the minds of the children that I looked at and worked with. So I think, I'm not saying anything new here about that online-offline relationship, but I think what's new is that we have data now regarding young children from the age of 5 and how diffuse they see this boundary. And I think it would be important to use this data to counter the arguments from those who would seek to limit children's access to online virtual worlds because of the concerns of safety and addiction and so on. So the data that I have, I think, shows that children are quite expert at navigating the online and offline boundary, and they make clear judgments about friendships and safety and security. The play in virtual worlds engenders rich forms of language play, literacy, and much reading and writing takes place. And these messages are important, I think, for teachers and parents and the wider public. And as I said earlier, it's not just to be simply celebratory. We know that bullying takes place, and we know that children are the focus for intensive marketing strategies. But I think we need to, these are issues we need to work on with children so that they, we can ensure that they engage critically with those environments. But I think, that work on critical literacy does need to be based on a sound understanding of what children know and are already do. They're already being quite critical in the way in which they, haven't showed some of the data today. But, they have ways of getting around what the producers intend them to get out of the worlds. They do have these transgressive behaviours, and we need to build on that. Okay, so someone's asked, what evidence that that like adults, children cannot be vulnerable on this internet? I think the work of Sonia Livingston, Aurora, is interesting in that sense. Sonia Livingston talks about those children who are online most often are also the ones that are open to more risks than children who are not online that often. So, the more they're on, the more they're online, the more they do have access to things that they shouldn't have access to, or and so on. But actually, what Livingston's argument is, and I would concur with this, is that for those children who aren't online that often, the fact that they're not getting challenged by these risky behaviours and so on means that they're not able to build up these safety strategies that other children use. So the children that I talked to in these studies, when I asked them, what safety rules do you have online, they were all able to say, well, don't give my name out, don't give my address out, don't give any real details out, and so on. Whereas, that's Sonia Livingston. I can't remember the name of the book, Children in the Internet Age or something like that, but excellent work that shows, risks. But I think unless we begin to map this territory of young children and tweens practices, we won't understand their progression in those areas such as, identity construction, developments of online relationships and knowledge of practices. So I will stop there. So we've got some minutes left for questions. You know, I do apologise for being back here. I didn't manage getting my presentation up very well. So I'll move to the front now, where I'll be able to sort of see people a little more clearly. And you know, please do ask any questions that you have, or you know, if you've done similar work, I'd be really interested to know about it. So thank you. It's a bit of a thrill for the children to be able to think that they've hoodwinked the producers, and I think that's absolutely part of their strategy. I think it's a shame about Club Penguin and some of the other games for children like Webkins and so on. A shame there is that you know, they don't allow user-generated content. So in the way that Second Life allows people to build, the children can't create their own content, and again, that would be very costly for the producers to do so. But you know, in this online world, producers really need to be thinking about that, I think, in order to make the world, you know, attractive. Someone said, is Club Penguin limited to kids? Yes, I kept saying children at home, and actually some of the parents were on as well. And I'm sure that, you know, other adults will always go into it, and I think it's got real family potential, I have to say. In Emily's family, the two sisters were on, and their mum, and the three of them were engaged in, you know, a lot of playing Club Penguin, which would seem to me to be very productive in terms of their family social relationships. And someone said Lego Universe is changing that. Yes, I think that's the future, and it's the way to go. And I think that, you know, the producers are realising that if they're going to have a commercial future, the children are going to be attracted to that. To be Destiny, yeah, I do think it is a product flaw, being not able to build content. The children complained a lot about that. One of the key complaints from the girls was when they bought a wig and then a crown, they couldn't put the two together. So even allowing children to do something simple like that would stop a lot of the frustrations, but certainly letting them build little things in their igloos, you know, would be really useful. I guess then they'd have to have a lot more moderation very closely. Okay, so Rurik's asking for a last question. Yes, that's a good point, Golden, about parental participation by fathers. In my work generally on media, I found that whereas mothers traditionally have been the ones reading picture books to children and so on, fathers are much more engaged in digital literacy practices. You know, having children sat on their laps from birth, playing PlayStation with them and so on. So a very positive element, I think, of these online games like Wii and so on, is the family engagement. Okay, so I think that was my last question, was it? I'll ask the chair.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for talking with us today, Jackie.
Okay, and as I say, apologies for messing about at the beginning. Thank you very much.
No, everybody gets to do that.
Okay, thank you very much.